I read The Disordered Cosmos, A Journey into Dark Matter, Spacetime, and Dreams Deferred by Chanda Prescod-Weinstein. This is a reread for me, and it's a nonfiction book. It's hard to put it in a category beyond that for me. It's not like a popular science type book, although it does do some popular science, explaining science to people who do not have a PhD like the professor does. It's not a memoir, although it involves a lot of personal stories. And she's very vulnerable throughout the book, or they are very vulnerable throughout the book. And it's not a work of like popular philosophy or activism, although I think it contains elements of those things as well. And so all of those put together make for a fascinating nonfiction book that kind of defies categorization, which isn't a bad thing, but maybe made the book difficult for her publisher to categorize and advertise. I don't know. I found it, and I don't think that the book is necessarily aimed at me, and I really have enjoyed each time that I've gone back to it. It's very provocative. I feel like the book is aimed at younger people, especially women or girls who are interested in science, as a way of encouraging them to pursue their dreams, but also giving them warning and helping them with a kind of reality check, but also kind of calling out people who are in the academic industry and demanding that they do better for the incoming generation and to make academia a better place, more equitable place for everyone, and for the benefit of human knowledge overall, not as an ask to like accommodate people or to, make some kind of reparation for problems caused in the past or something like that. But just if people have more time and freedom to themselves, then there will be more scientific discovery, more thoughtful work, more scientific productivity in academia. That's kind of part of her argument. On one level, it's sad and shameful that there needs to be an argument to treat everyone equally and fairly, but it's important to point out the inequalities in every institution, and science is a fundamental institution to the power of the American project since probably the early 20th century, but certainly since World War II, I think. The book examines the way in which science tries to market itself as being unbiased and in touch with a kind of quote unquote natural way of knowing and transmitting information, of constructing models of how the universe operates and naming things within that model in kind of politically and socially frictionless ways, and how all of that marketing is a false veneer on a more deep-seated colonial project that emanates out of the white supremacy that started before but worked its way through the Enlightenment all the way up until today. And how science sees itself as European and post-European project and doesn't acknowledge the larger work of civilizations that preceded Europe, and puts Europe like in a special place as the origin point of human knowledge. Dr. Prescod-Weinstein is a scientist who works in dark matter, I think. I don't know anything about her field really. I mean, I understand that like dark matter and dark energy as an idea, I get what they are, but in no way, can I really understand in the kind of depth that a scientist does anything about that stuff. But she does talk about the language around the choices of calling it dark matter, dark energy, and how that is supposed to signify not being able to perceive what this matter or energy out in the universe is. And mathematics tells us that at a guess, it takes up most of the portion of total matter and energy in the universe. And yet we don't really have a good way of knowing exactly what it is or any of its properties because its nature is non-interactive with the kind of matter that we are made of. But there's a tradition in European and American culture that things that are dark are also sinister, evil, and bad, but also that color is associated with the color of skin of people who are descended from the victims of slavery. And so if the descendants of slaves had been included in the scientific project of American science in the 20th century more fully, would they have named it dark matter? Like, probably not, because they would have had an awareness of this. And she offers up various alternative names for the field. And she talks about other naming conventions and how they're more whimsical, but also telling in terms of that they were probably named by men. And these things are not, like I said earlier, frictionless, natural, or anything like that, right? Because names are kind of arbitrary and therefore just come down to the whim of the person involved in the naming. And so all of that person's social background comes to bear in that decision of naming things. And this might not seem especially important on the surface when it comes to talking about equity and inclusivity and fairness to people. Like, what does it matter if things are named, dark energy or wimps or whatever in science? That's not talking about a person, but it does create an environment and a culture, and it gives people certain thoughts because words are connected to other words and they lead us down a train of thought. And that's another thing that she points out in the book quite a bit, that science doesn't have this smooth and natural, frictionless aspect to it that it tries to present. It is a human culture that has its own ideology and is built on sets of beliefs. And those beliefs can change if pressure is applied and awareness is raised. And the changing of beliefs can lead to a change of habit and a change in policy. And so this is the kind of activist hierarchy of how to achieve change in a culture. Is that you change the beliefs of people. This leads to different thoughts. This leads to different actions, which ultimately leads to different outcomes. And so language can be an origin point for that. She doesn't only concentrate on language, she also points out the ways in which science will assume who is a person and what the qualities of a person are. And she gives the example of automatic soap dispensers and how they were not calibrated in such a way as to account for the high melanin in some people's skin. And so when the infrared scanner hits high melanin skin, the melanin naturally absorbs the infrared radiation and does not reflect it back. Therefore, the soap dispenser does not know to dispense soap. And so when a Black person holds their hands underneath the soap dispenser, nothing happens because it was calibrated and built for white people, assuming that white people are the default person in the world. And so this is an example of this idea of a frictionless default society, that this is the way that people are. They have white skin. And so we're going to calibrate instruments to deal with that. In the same way, our culture is calibrated to defer to whiteness. And this is largely unnoticed by people who are not ever challenged in their whiteness in this very simple kind of way that I'm talking about. And so, like, if you try to get soap from a soap dispenser and it doesn't work, you're like, well, this thing is broken. What's going on? That's not a common occurrence for a white person to be like, the thing must be empty, not the thing must be built for a different kind of human being because I'm not the human being anybody has in mind when they build things. That's not a thought that's going to occur to the average white person in the culture. And all of science and all of academia is built that way, but it doesn't want to admit that it is built that way or do anything about it. And at the same time, they talk about having experienced sexual discrimination, sexual violence, and how these things are also encoded into academia culture and the need for change around that as well. They're very vulnerable about the aftermath of the experience, not having to really talk about the details of the experience itself so much, but the PTSD, the panic attacks that are ongoing, the way it affects the relationship with their partner, and just the simple amount of time that all of that takes up in their life when they could be doing science instead, and how wasteful that is to have in the culture. They talk about how women don't typically get credit for the work that they've done in science all throughout history. Even some of the greatest discoverers in astronomy and whatnot are described as helpers or assistants and not as full scientists, despite the fact that we'll give credit to past male scientists and include them in communities that didn't exist at the time and kind of elevate them into the positions that exist now in a retroactive way of speaking. And so we call like Newton a physicist, even though no one was ever called a physicist in his own time. But we're not willing to dispense with that kind of language for women. And so again, there's the focus on language there, but demonstrating the way that language is deployed inequitably and how there's not room to talk about non-binary people, trans people, and these kind of gender labels within the scientific academic community. And these kind of things, since the book has been written, have only become worse. And of course, since 2025, massive reductions in the funding of science in America have taken place, as well as the removal of DEI protections. And so all of the things that the doctor writes about in the book have elevated into an almost crisis level in academia and will probably continue to not only be a problem, but are being exacerbated. And so they were really like sounding the alarm before these things got to the crisis level that they're at now. But the book is more relevant than ever, I think. So the idea that science is a social, cultural practice is a really important thing to remember in terms of like the acquisition of knowledge is not an automatic human process. that has a single way of happening that produces objective single results, that there are many different avenues, and that human cultures throughout history have always been producing science, have always been asking questions and finding different ways to find answers. And knowledge acquisition has many different avenues to it. And equity has to be, and justice and these kind of things have to be the foundation for a new way of acquiring knowledge that's going to allow us to form a new culture. They have a vision that if we had a stable scientific culture with the right mindset, that the rest of society could kind of build out or grow out around it. But as things stand now, science is a handmaiden to the military industrial complex of nation states that brand themselves as being democratic, but are just an end product of colonialist ideologies. And so they make a call for a different kind of culture that needs to be constructed, and different voices who need to be made room for within academia. They call this the cosmology of the oppressed, and talks about how, the communities that are excluded or left out of the system need to be brought in more tightly. And I think the book is a kind of praxis to that philosophy in reaching out to young people of color, young queer people who feel outside of the academic sphere and that it's not possible for them. And Dr. Chandra is saying, like, I was one of the first ones to achieve this. It is possible. There are people here, but we need more people. We need more people to try. And you are valid. You are seen. And so they are opening up the conversation and the space with this book as a work of activism, basically. And not an end in itself, but one brick in the wall, so to speak. So, like I said, I've read the book a few times. It's very challenging. It's very uncomfortable. It's a difficult book. It stirs up lots of feelings in me. But I can't disagree with the call for greater justice and a more inclusive, equitable form of academic science. And science and education are so important in our culture. And I think that we can see the results of a dearth of education over decades and the swift decline of political discourse and scientific discovery even within our society. And so, I think those things are directly linked. The way that funding in science operates is dysfunctional, and the way that academia itself is both overloaded with jobs and underfunded speaks to a lack of vision in the culture, and also a kind of stultifying way that hierarchies are constructed and egos are stoked, and a lot of kind of cultural corruption and rot exists that needs to be sloughed off and reformed one way or another. I mean, it will happen if we could choose to make it happen, or it can just collapse under its own weight. So it is a choice for us as a culture to make, and the people within the culture and the people who want to enter the academic culture specifically. And that's the call that the doctor is making in the book. And so it's an important thing to contemplate outside of my field. I'm not in academia at all. I'm just a lower working class guy, but I try to have an awareness and grow myself in regards to these issues.